Hello, and welcome to the Reproductive Justice Research Network. My name is Dr. Sanchez-Rivera, and I'm a research fellow in Gonville and Keys and an affiliate lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge. Today, we're going to be talking with Professor Dorothy Roberts from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and Sociology, and she will be presenting a talk titled Policing Black Women's Health in the United States. We upload videos regularly, so please do make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, for the most up-to-date news, please make sure to like and follow us on Twitter at Reproductive Justice Chem and Facebook. The links to this are in the description below. Thank you very much.
I'll be able to join you all the way across the ocean, from across the ocean. And I look forward to our discussion. And congratulations, Aideen, did I say on your defense of your dissertation and also on your successful seminar series this year. I'm happy to be the wrap-up speaker. Okay, so I'll share my screen. Does that look good? Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to be talking about policing Black women's health, and I decided to talk on that topic to put together some of the work I've been doing over really the last 3 decades and thinking about how the themes that I've been writing about and speaking about and acting over work together in a way that not only polices Black women's bodies and lives, but also has a huge influence on policies related to health, especially reproductive health in the United States. Oh yes, I forgot to add, I had put in the United States, but I think it'll be interesting to talk about some of the parallels in the UK and other parts of the world as well. The policing of Black women's health cuts across a number of disciplinary and political arenas, including reproductive health and rights, biomedicine, and family policing. And these are topics that I've written about over the last 30 years in my book, Killing the Black Body, which focused on the regulation of Black women's childbearing, Fatal Invention, which deals with the resurgence of biological concepts of race. And I'll touch on how that resurgence has affected the approach to disparities in Black women's health, especially maternal mortality. Shattered Bonds and Torn Apart are 2 of my books where I examine racism in what's called the child welfare system. I prefer to call it the family policing system. And so I want to talk about how all of these different disciplinary and political arenas are tied together in the policing of Black women's health. So some of the ways that policing Black women's health in the United States operates is that it helps, and why there's so much of it is that it helps to mask structural racism by treating it as if it's natural, that the harms that stem from structural racism naturally occur from particular deficiencies in Black women's bodies. It works to control Black women's bodies and lives by both practically as a way through the asserted need to either regulate or even improve Black women's health as an excuse for state control over Black women's bodies and decision-making. And then also it promotes racial capitalist policies by using these asserted needs to police Black women's health for the sake of Black women themselves, their communities, and the nation as a way of hiding, obscuring, and even justifying the continuation of white supremacist political structures, and also the reliance on market-based solutions to structural inequities. So that's overall what I want to talk about, but I'm going to give examples of that and explain all of this in greater detail. So to understand the roots of how policing Black women's health helps to support a racial capitalist system, we need to go back to its roots in the enslavement of African people in the United States and the way in which control of Black women's reproductive labor and exploitation of their reproductive labor was essential not only to maintaining the racial capitalist system that depended entirely on slavery, because of course, the children that Black women bore were the assets and the future labor force under a slave system, but also because of the way that the very meaning of race was interpreted as a natural, innate difference between human beings. The idea that race is a natural division of human beings was essential to maintaining the racial caste system of slavery. And it was important that race was seen as a status that was produced by Black women's childbearing. And this was embedded in law. It was, I write in Fatal Invention that race was invented. It was invented in law, initially in Europe by European philosophers and scientists who claimed that some natural force divided all human beings into races, but it was then cemented into law and invented as this natural division that destined white people to be enslavers and Black people to be enslaved through laws that the colonists in the 1600s passed. And a key one of those laws was the 1622 law, where the Virginia colonists asked, what is the status of children born to Negro women and fathered by Englishmen? These were children who were produced by sexual assaults of white men on Black women. And they had to figure out what the status of these children should be under British patriarchal laws of kinship and inheritance. They would have been white like their fathers, but the colonists in Virginia decided that it was more advantageous to building a racial caste system that enslaved Black people to make these children have the status of their mothers. And I see this as the origin of both the definition of Black versus white, white as pure European and Black as having eventually any trace of African ancestry. So it was important to the definition of these racial distinctions, the demarcations that determined who was Black and white, but also just as importantly to the idea that race is a natural trait that's reproduced. And I see this decision to make children's enslaved status follow supposedly naturally from their mother's reproduction as the origins of the notion that Black women pass down the disadvantaged status of their children through their childbearing. That idea, as I'll show, resonates through policies and messages that are very powerful in the United States, and I suspect in the United Kingdom as well, to this day. Now, this idea that Black women's bodies could be exploited for the benefit of white enslavers and white people in general led to experimentation on enslaved Black women, like the experimentation by J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of gynecology, who performed painful surgeries, experimental surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia, and also a century later, on the taking of Henrietta Lacks's cells at Johns Hopkins University without her consent, and their use for treatments of multiple kinds of treatments for people. Sorry, there's a little bit of noise going on in the background. One thing I find fascinating and very contradictory is that part of the reason why it was seen as ethical for white physicians to experiment on Black women's bodies was because Black women were a different kind of human being that had fewer rights, if any rights. Of course, during the slavery era, they had no rights to consent or not to consent to whatever enslavers wanted to do to them. But even in the 20th century, the idea that Black women could be treated in a colored ward, as Henrietta Lacks was, and had no right to consent or not to consent to the taking of her cells. So Black women as having a devalued status based on an idea that they were innately distinct human beings, distinct from white people. But at the same time, their bodies were being used to develop therapies to benefit white people. And so there's this deep, profound contradiction of a belief in the innate difference of Black women in order to justify their exploitation, but at the same time, an understanding that their bodies could be used to benefit people of other races. We see, stemming from these ideas rooted in the enslavement of Black women, a continuation of a reproductive caste system where Black women are treated as producing disadvantage biologically, naturally, through their reproduction for their children, and this being a justification for state regulation of their health. And here's an example of this idea that Black women innately produce, as this author in an op-ed in 1990 wrote, a bio underclass of infants, a concept that Black women give birth to biologically deficient children. And this author is saying it doesn't matter exactly what the cause is, whether it's because they're on welfare, whether they're smoking crack, or what the cause of the benefit is, the deficit is, that Black women produce these biologically, innately biologically disadvantaged children from the moment of conception. I just find this to be such a stunning description of this myth about Black women's childbearing. and the way in which it blames Black women's reproduction for the disadvantages of their children. Yes, these children are disadvantaged, but they're disadvantaged because of structural racism. And it gets, their mothers get blamed for it, but blamed for it in a way that casts their very procreation as dangerous. So this idea that Black women's fertility is a biological threat that produces social problems has been reinforced by just a myriad of stereotypes that in the United States are so common that people know, they recognize them, they know what they mean. You don't even have to say Black, in order for people to know this refers to Black women. So welfare queen in America is a Black welfare queen. And it's commonly known that this is a woman who has babies just to get a welfare check. And then she wastes the money on herself, on luxury items for herself, and doesn't spend it on her children. So she has no interest in caring for her children, and she is deviously having too many children just to rip off white taxpayers in America. This was such a powerful icon of Black women that it helped to fuel a radical change in welfare policy in the United States with the abolition of the federal entitlement to welfare or aid for children of impoverished mothers. It also helped to support the support recommendations that birth control, coerced birth control, be used to end Black childhood poverty. Again, the idea that the reason for Black childhood poverty, not structural racism, but because of the reproduction of Black mothers. So even in a major newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the main editorial page suggested that the reason why Black children are living in poverty is that the people having the most children are the least capable of supporting them, and recommended using Norplant, which is a long-acting reversible contraceptive that's implanted surgically in someone's forearm and has to be surgically removed. So it's a very potentially coercive form of birth control, that this would be the answer to reducing the Black underclass, that bio underclass that the Houston paper was referring to, now recommending in the Philadelphia Inquirer the use of a temporary form of sterilization as a solution. And of course, we know that there has been a long history in the United States of using coerced sterilization as a form of addressing these perceived social problems created by Black women's fertility, including the operation of the North Carolina Eugenics Board into the 1970s, at which point it was mostly forcing the sterilizations of Black women who were receiving welfare benefits. Forced sterilizations have continued in the United States. It was revealed in 2013 that there was a policy in California prisons of pressuring or forcing incarcerated women as part of their gender program to be sterilized. That was exposed by Justice Now and led to, because of the activism of Black and brown women who had been sterilized, along with Justice Now, led to a passage of legislation to curb sterilizations in prisons in California. And then subsequently, there was the revelation that in a Georgia detention facility, ICE detention facilities, this is for undocumented immigrants, that there was also a program of forced sterilization. And of course, it's probably going on in other detention facilities and prisons now that, and just has not been exposed. Of course, it's very difficult for incarcerated people to protest against these kinds of sterilization programs. Shackling during delivery continues in prisons across the nation, even though some states have passed legislation to end it. But even in states like New York, where legislation has been passed, there is evidence it continues. This is shackling pregnant people while they're in the course of labor and delivery, ostensibly to prevent them from escaping when it's obvious that there's no way they could escape. There's armed guards watching them and they're in the middle of delivering a baby. So there really is no other purpose than to dehumanize and terrorize and torture them. And then we also see the rise of the criminalization of pregnancy, beginning with the prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant and using drugs. This began in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when hundreds of Black women were prosecuted for being pregnant and smoking crack cocaine. This then led later to charging women with homicide for stillbirths and miscarriages. And the first was Regina McKnight, a 21-year-old woman who was sentenced to 20 years in prison when she had a stillbirth, and there was evidence that she used drugs while pregnant, but no good evidence that her drug use caused the stillbirth, or that she had the mens rea, the mental state required for this crime. She eventually was able to overturn the conviction based on ineffective assistance of counsel, because her lawyer did not challenge the expert testimony that was flawed, that she caused the stillbirth. But she spent 8 years in prison. And in the United States, we've seen several subsequent cases of women being prosecuted for miscarriages and stillbirths. So we are seeing at the same time that, as you know, in the United States, there is the threat, the very real threat, that Roe versus Wade will be overturned and abortion will be illegal, criminalized in many states in the United States. There is this confluence of criminalizing people for pregnancy outcomes, as well as now criminalizing them for abortions. And that's why we can say there is a wholesale criminalization of pregnancy, regardless of whether there was the intent to terminate the pregnancy or not. And also regardless of what the outcome is, as long as it is an outcome that the state says was not protective enough of the fetus. Ironically, or paradoxically, I suppose, the message that the most dangerous place for a Black child is in the womb, is a Black woman's uterus. This message of dangerous Black women's childbearing not only is used to support sterilizing Black women or otherwise deterring them from having children, but also used as in this billboard to shame Black women for terminating pregnancies. And I think it is really astounding, staggering, stunning the way in which this message that we can trace back to slavery and see so many examples of in myths about Black women's childbearing and policies that it can be used both to support abortion, bans on abortion, and used to support policies to sterilize Black women. And, I've long said that these aren't contradictory policies, that banning abortion and promoting coerced sterilization work together to limit Black women's control, freedom and control over their lives, especially their reproductive lives. And so I see them as coordinated policies. And so it's no surprise that they are supported by the exact same false message about Black women's childbearing. As I mentioned before, another policy outcome is the restructuring of welfare in the United States. The end of the federal entitlement to welfare benefits for impoverished families. This is disproportionately Black mothers who need income support to take care of their children. An entitlement that existed since the 1930s was ended under a Democratic administration, a bipartisan effort in the United States, signed by Bill Clinton in 1996 to restructure welfare so that it is no longer a federal entitlement to assistance, but is now a behavior modification program, with Congress explicitly saying in the preamble to this law that the solution to, they didn't say Black mothers, but all of the campaign surrounding this focused on this Black welfare queen, and this disproportionately affects Black mothers. So they were telling Black mothers the way to end poverty in Black single mother households was for these mothers to take low-wage jobs. And there's all sorts of programs connected to this law to force Black mothers into low-wage work, to get married. And a lot of the rhetoric was about how the problem these mothers were having was that they weren't married and marriage would be the solution. Of course, I probably don't have to tell you that there's lots of evidence, including the reports of these mothers themselves, but also other kinds of social science evidence that shows that marriage will not significantly improve their welfare, because the men they would marry also are impoverished and with high rates of incarceration. And then in addition, the other aspect of this behavior modification is they should stop having so many children. And this law allowed for the passage in the United States of so-called family caps or family exclusion policies that deny any increase in benefits to mothers who have additional children while they're on welfare. So prior to this law, it was illegal. It violated federal law not to give an increase in benefits to someone who had another child while they were already on welfare. Now, many states have passed laws that deny any increase, and it's explicitly to deter women on welfare from having additional children. So it's a population control law. And then another law that was passed the following year that gets far less attention is the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And this was a law that was supposed to deal with the expanding foster care population in the United States. Again, very racialized campaign with many people who promoted this law pointing to the numbers of Black children who were languishing in foster care. And this was a result of the massive increase in both the foster care population, but also in the numbers of Black children who were being taken from their families and put in foster care. So the reason why the foster care population exploded from the 1970s to the 1990s was because Black families were being brought into this system. And we see a very stark pivot from providing services to intact families to foster care, taking children from their families and putting them in a foster industrial complex as the main so-called service to Black families. And the vast majority of money being spent in the child welfare system going to taking children away and maintaining them apart from their families. So this led to a huge increase in the foster care population, and the solution that Congress came to in 1997 was a law that prioritized adoption. The solution was to give states incentives to push children into adoptive homes, and also it included a provision to speed up termination of parents' rights. And some of the promotion for this law was explicitly racialized, that Black children should be freed from their legal mothers. And this was the terminology used, they should be freed from their mothers so that they could be adopted. And in some places, this was tied to the promotion of transracial adoption. So explicitly stated that these children would be better off if adopted by white families. Now, I think it's important to see these two laws passed just a year apart as a part of a coherent approach to Black child poverty that says, no, it should not be treated by the government supporting their parents, especially their mothers, with income, guaranteed income, but instead should be dealt with, I should say, by taking children away from their Black mothers and putting them in substitute care. And it is the first time in US history where there was a federal mandate to states to so-called protect children from child maltreatment, but not joining entitlement to families to get some support. So very clear, dramatic shift in US policy toward a neoliberal approach of relying on the market, on low-wage work, on marriage, on adoption, and away from relying on state income supports to impoverished families, with the greatest impact on Black mothers and with these racist stereotypes about Black mothers fueling both of these policies. Another development in the United States, and I know this is true in the UK as well. I think I see Jenny Douglas there in the background, and I know that she has been studying this issue in the UK as well. And in the United States, there is and this problem you don't have in the UK because it doesn't exist in any other so-called developed nation. We have an actual increase in maternal deaths in the United States, an upward trend. And this is largely because of the astronomical, atrocious amount of deaths of Black women from pregnancy-related causes, far greater than deaths of white women in the United States. And there's been a lot of advocacy around this, but there continues to be this misguided, racist approach that looks at some deficit in Black women's bodies. Again, this theme that Black women's childbearing is innately dangerous. And we see biomedical researchers looking for some genetic reason why Black women are more likely to have preterm births, more likely to have maternal mortality, why their infants are more likely to die in the first year. And here's an example of a truly outrageous hypothetical hypothesis, I should say, for the study, that Black race, independent of other factors, increases the risk for extreme preterm birth. I mean, just think about this idea that there's some entity, some essence, some trait that we could call Black race that could be isolated from all the social factors that would contribute to extreme preterm birth, so that it's possible to conclude that just some innate genetic trait in Black women is a cause for this health inequity. Of course, the study could not prove that because it did not control for the factors that contribute. It also could not define what they mean by Black race, who would be included among their research participants in Black race versus other races. So the study was, from the hypothesis, was deeply flawed, and yet it got a headline in the New York Times that the study pointed to genetics in disparities in preterm births, which it did not do, it could not do, and yet the public gets this reinforcement from the major news outlet in the United States, or at least newspaper in the United States, that genetics is the cause for this health inequity. Again, reinforcing the idea that Black women innately have some deficit or defect that they pass on to their children. The bio underclass. Another aspect of the way in which these false myths about Black women's innate differences and deficits affects medical care is the undertreatment of Black people for pain. And this affects Black women in particular. And there's a important recent study that linked the undertreatment of Black patients for pain in the United States to false beliefs about racial biological differences. It found that a substantial number of white medical students and residents in the study at a major medical school in the United States held false beliefs about biological differences between Blacks and whites. They believed, for example, that Black people had thicker skin than white people, and Black people had less sensitive nerve endings than white people. And the researchers found that these beliefs predicted this racial bias in the perception of how much pain people were in, and then accordingly, their recommendations for pain treatment. Now, this has been documented, this undertreatment of Black people for pain has been documented across lots of different kinds of diagnoses and prescriptions, including long bone fractures, appendicitis in children. But I just want to point out that it also has affected Black women's reproductive health and may be contributing to the higher rates of Black maternal mortality. A study found unequal treatment for pain following cesarean deliveries, with Black women less likely to get adequate pain treatment. Another area where this idea of innate racial differences affects medicine is race correction. And this is where there are automatic adjustments for the patient's race in clinical algorithms or diagnostic or prescription tools. One of the that I'm putting this chart here, not because I expect you to read it, but because it lists all these different fields of medicine where these automatic race corrections are made, in cardiology, in nephrology or kidney disease, in urology, in obstetrics, just virtually in the United States, and I don't know if this goes on in the UK as well, but in the US, virtually every area of medicine, there are called corrections or adjustments for race, especially for Black patients. So just to give you one example, there's an important indicator of kidney function called glomerular filtration rate. And if you get, in the US, if you get a routine blood test, you'll see eGFR on your blood test. And although we've been making changes, but still in most health systems in the United States, there is an automatic upward adjustment for Black patients or African-American patients. And if you haven't encountered this before, let me just emphasize, it is automatic and categorical. So if you are identified as a Black patient, you get a different output, a different number than any other human being, automatically. This has been shown to harm patients. There's been recent studies that show that this race correction for kidney function is harmful. For example, it keeps thousands and thousands of Black patients off of a kidney transplant waiting list because their number has been adjusted to a healthier looking number. But it also has been found to be harmful to Black women in the reproductive context. They found that there had been an automatic adjustment in the calculator for the VBAC, whether you could be recommended to have a vaginal birth after a C-section. And there was an automatic adjustment that for Black women that made it seem more dangerous. So this would be a factor in increasing C-sections for Black women in America. Another study from my university, University of Pennsylvania, found that race was used to diagnose anemia in pregnancy. And this was based on the idea that Black women naturally had lower iron levels. And so the test for whether the obstetrician should be concerned about anemia during pregnancy was adjusted upward for Black women to make it seem as if they were healthier. There should be less of a concern. And I don't know that you need a study to figure out that that would be harmful, that would lead to poorer outcomes for Black women because they're less likely to be treated for anemia during pregnancy. But this study found that it was harmful. All right. I want to turn to how these ideas about Black mothers' deficits and need for supervision and control affect policies in the US child welfare system, which I call a family policing system. And I call it a family policing system because it is a system that isn't designed to keep children safe, to improve their welfare. It's designed to accuse parents of child maltreatment, investigate their families, take their children away from them, put them in a dangerous so-called foster care system, and in many cases, terminate permanently the legal relationship between children and their families. It stems from a history of oppression against Black families and Native families in America, beginning with the slavery system where Black families could be separated at the will of enslavers and often were, and also the system of child apprenticeship after the Civil War, when free Black children were returned to white enslavers as apprentices on grounds that their parents were neglecting them. And also the history of using child removal as a weapon of war against Native tribes during the so-called Indian Wars in the United States, and the continuing into the 20th century of removing Indigenous children from their homes and putting them in white-run boarding schools and putting them up for adoption by white families. And even in the case of European immigrant children, putting them into foster care to work for other families and even putting them on so-called orphan trains. They weren't orphans, they were just taken from their families and shipped from the East Coast out to farms in the Midwest and Southwest to work for stranger families. In the US, these same communities, Native American Black communities, continue to be disproportionately separated by the system, with up to 15% of Native children being removed and more than 10% of Black children removed from their homes by the time they reach age 18. Another study recently found that half of all Black children in America, more than half, will be subject to a child maltreatment investigation by the time they reach age 18. So this is a common experience for Black children in America. This system not only separates families, but is a massive form of surveillance of families in Black communities. And it turns the very professionals, teachers, doctors, social service providers who could be providing assistance to families into deputized agents for the state, because we have a system of so-called mandated reporting where these very professionals, instead of providing help and support, are trained to call child abuse hotlines and report families to a system that does not address their needs and instead is a form of terror and disruption, and again, often child removal and termination of family relationships. It also is deeply entangled with criminal law enforcement, both in terms of the way it operates as an investigative, accusatory, prosecutorial, punitive system, but also working hand in hand with police officers, with caseworkers often bringing police officers along, armed officers. Of course, you know, in the United States, they are armed officers into families' homes to inspect the home, to take children away. And increasingly, these joint task forces where caseworkers and police officers train together and surveil and disrupt communities together. And so I argue in my book, Torn Apart, they are part of one carceral web that's designed to oppress Black communities, not at all to protect and improve the welfare of children in those communities. This relates to the reproductive health of Black women because in hospitals across the United States, there is routine drug testing in a very racist way of Black mothers and newborns, and then reporting of them to Child Protective Services. Clear evidence that this is done in a racially biased way, with Black mothers far more likely to be tested than white mothers, and almost exclusively in impoverished neighborhoods or with impoverished patients. This is something that is a profound aspect of the family policing system, which is it is designed to target the most marginalized communities, and white affluent communities do not have to fear at all this kind of disruption. So doctors may claim they're mandated reporters, but they're mandated to report on impoverished Black families. They're not mandated to report on middle class or affluent white families, and they don't. So child maltreatment follows along this line of seeing Black mothers as producing, transferring deficits, disadvantages to their children because of some innate deficit that they have that justifies policies of punishment and surveillance and regulation. And this is in the very notion of what child maltreatment is, not looking at the harms that structural inequities cause to children, which of course are the main harms to children in the United States, but seeing child maltreatment as a parental pathology and that stems from cognitive deficits that require therapeutic cures. So one of the main cures for these perceived cognitive deficits in Black mothers or pathologies in Black mothers that cause them to maltreat their children is parent training. Almost all of the mandates that go out to Black mothers, or to any family caregiver who gets involved in the system, is you need parental training. And that is, you're more likely to get ordered to take parent training classes than you are to get a home if you're houseless. And that's why your children were taken away from you. You're not going to be placed in a home to take care of your problem of homelessness. You're going to be told to take a parent training class to figure out why you had the pathology of raising your children in a homeless shelter. Now, Black feminism has recognized for a long time, but especially coming out of the 1970s, the fact that these systems of oppression and these institutions I've been talking about, the criminal legal system, the healthcare system, the family policing system, they are interlocking systems of oppression. And Black women in particular have a position in these interlocking systems of oppression that is a target for these policies. As the Combahee River Collective statement said, Black women have a position in US society that is antithetical to white male rule. And so not only is it the case that we see Black women being the focus of these intersecting punitive systems and ideologies that support them and myths that support them, but also Black women have been at the center of resistance against them and developing approaches, analyses for abolishing them and replacing them with approaches that truly support human freedom and caring for each other. And so I'm sure this group knows the tenets of reproductive justice, but I'll just repeat them because we can see how reproductive justice addresses these interlocking ways in which Black women's health has been policed across so many disciplines, so many fields, so many institutions, so many ways of thinking. And importantly, it has advocated from the very beginning that reproductive justice has to include the human right to have or not have children, but also to parent children in a safe and supportive environment. It has also supported community-based mutual aid, which is one of the key ways that we can replace these oppressive systems like the family policing system with radically different ways of supporting families and keeping children safe. And one of those is Black midwives and the tradition of Black midwives providing care, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, anti-heterosexual care in heterosexist care in communities. And I see this as one of the models for how we know we can abolish the system of family policing and replace it with better, more caring, more effective ways of actually improving the welfare of children. And so I'll just end with a call for taking lessons from various abolitionist movements, the movement to abolish policing, the movement to abolish prisons, the movement to abolish the prison industrial complex writ large, and the growing movement to abolish the family policing system, the movement for reproductive justice as a collective movement where we have common values, we have a common imagination of the world we want to build, and so much potential for solidarity among these movements that I have hope for real radical change in the United States, and also an understanding of the global connections of both these oppressive systems, but also movements for resistance against them and for radical transformation. So I'm especially happy then to be able to engage with all of you in the UK and maybe other parts of the world as well. Who knows who's joined us to think about these issues and work toward a transformation of the world toward one that is truly free and equitable and caring. So I'll end there, and I'm happy to take questions and comments and engage in conversation with all of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for that talk, Professor Roberts. I have many questions, but I was wondering if anybody wanted to ask, or if I can use my magical chair powers to ask my question. So I think one of the questions that I had was how this idea of like the bio underclass or biological underclass, as well as like the welfare queen, and how you say like, like you don't have to say Black for it to mean Black, and how like there's different like racialization processes that get like hidden under the guise of like biology, or like this idea of like the welfare queen. And I was wondering like how post-racialism and like this seemingly like colorblind ideologies like don't do us any favors. And I was wondering like if you can like talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great connection you're making there, because one of the reasons why being colorblind does not address racism is for that very reason, that many of these narratives work with a code for race. And so they themselves are ostensibly colorblind. This is one of the central principles or understandings of systemic or structural racism, is that you don't need an explicit statement of race in order for it to be racist and support white supremacy. And so for that reason, if you're colorblind, you don't address the latent racism that undergirds these policies and is the objective of the policies, they will just continue as is. You're not only haven't done anything positive, but you are allowing racist structures to continue. And that is, I think, is a form of unethical action through omission. And so I think that understanding the way in which racism operates in the post-civil rights era, where states no longer explicitly put race in government policy, is an important understanding, and helps to explain why colorblindness is actually a right-wing strategy to allow the status quo of white supremacy to continue. Now it's interesting that we now live in a world where explicit white supremacy and white nationalism is more common. And I say explicit, of course, it's always been there, but it now is being promoted in social media. And even we see it on national television in the United States with messages about the fear of white people being replaced by people of color, these kinds of ideas being stated explicitly in the media, and white supremacist groups having a platform on social media with websites and blogs, and it becomes super obvious in the United States, and I know this is going on in Europe as well, when white nationalists commit acts of violence and then the police go back and look at their websites and see these explicit statements of white supremacy. I'll just mention one other connection to this, which is that even though the official approach to race in the United States is no longer to explicitly state racial categories and classifications like was the norm during the Jim Crow era, and prior to that as well, the slavery era. As I mentioned, in biomedicine and genomics, and this was the subject of my book, Fatal Invention, and this is exactly why I wrote that book, there is a resurgence in this idea that there are actually biological differences between races, and it is legitimate science to look for them and conduct research about them and write studies about them, and to make this a hypothesis, peer-reviewed scientific studies. And my argument in Fatal Invention was that this was a way to rationalize continuing racial inequities in the United States by arguing that they are the result not of racist social structures, but innate differences between races. And I think I showed in my talk multiple examples of how that is being promoted in science today. And this is not just in the United States, this is definitely a global issue. Even in European nations where it is, you won't get government funding for a study that uses racial categories. I know at least in France, that at least a few years ago, I participated in a project that showed that there was a move to allow it in medicine, based on the idea that these racial differences actually do exist. So this is a global trend to resuscitate these ideas of biological racial difference in contemporary genomic and biomedical science, under the guise that this is now advanced scientific knowledge that can be distinguished from eugenics or from white supremacist thought because the scientists are not racist. You know, it's sort of this idea, we can use these racist ideas, but they're not really racist because we're not racist. We're doing this to benefit Black people. Yeah, this is the excuse for race corrections, which are now being shown to harm Black patients. Oh, but we're treating Black patients differently for their own good. Okay, that was the same excuse they used during the slavery era and during eugenics. You know, in Buck v. Bell, Oliver Wendell Holmes upheld eugenicist sterilization on grounds that it was good for the people being sterilized, because then they could be let out of the institutions they were being kept in. So I just want to, I guess I'm just adding that there is this right-wing and liberal colorblindness that obscures the way in which structural racism works, but we're also seeing a resurgence of explicit racial categorization that is excused by the good intentions of the scientists using it. And I'll just add one more thing, which is it's over and over again, we see in the US that white supremacist groups are using these genetic studies on their websites. So this came out a couple of years ago when the American Society of Human Genetics had its annual meeting. And it was a big controversy because people were pointing out that some of the members of the society had their research on white supremacist websites. And their excuse is, well, it's not our fault white supremacists are using our research. And, you know, I want to ask them, have you looked at the falsehoods, you know, the false ideas in your research itself? And this just came out with the shooting, the killing in Buffalo, New York, where a white supremacist 18-year-old killed a number of people in a grocery store where he went deliberately to kill Black people. And then they found that on his website, he was citing genetic research. And it came out again, how they're using, you know, these white supremacists are misusing this research. But the research is based on a white supremacist idea that race is a natural division of human beings. And you cannot hold on to that false concept of human beings and just say, well, as long as we don't use it for racist ends, it's all right. You know, as long as we don't say the races are unequal, it's all right. But they're using it as the basis of algorithms that do treat people of different races unequally. Blatantly done. And I think that supports this idea, which I emphasize in my talk, that Black mothers are innately deficient and they pass on the disadvantage to their children through their childbearing. And that, again, has been the excuse for so many policies that not only harm us and our children, our families, our communities, but also support a racial capitalist approach that harms everyone in the United States. You know, so when people say, why does the US have the stingiest social welfare system? Why do we take away the most children of any nation in the world, but we incarcerate the most people of any nation in the world, and we have the highest rates of childhood poverty of any developed nation, so-called developed nation? A lot of it is because of the power of these messages about Black mothers.
Yeah, definitely. That was a fantastic answer. Like, there's so much that I want to say.
I'm sorry, I tend to go on.
Oh no, it was
your great question. It reminded me of so many themes.
Oh no, thank you very much. And like, I think like just like talking about genomics, like one of the most interesting things about this, and I see it in my own context, in the context of Latin America, is like how genomics are used like as a way of like supporting these ideas around like mixed raceness, or like the racialization processes that are inside of the nation state, especially with the works of like people like Sarah Abel or Peter Wade and Carlos Lopez Beltran in Mexico as well. But at the
Mhm.
same time, like there's other academics that are explicitly advocating to bring back eugenics, and they say it like very explicitly. So you have that divide between like mixed raceness as like a racial democracy, but also mixed raceness as a racial hierarchy that is still
Yeah.
very much blatant in this like new like scientific research.
Yes, yes. As I said, it's a global issue, and the concept of biological race, stretches around the globe, influences social policy and science around the globe. But it's also fascinating to look at how it differs in different cultures and societies and political contexts, which supports the view that it isn't natural. If it was natural, then it would be the same. If race was actually a biological classification within the human species created by some force of nature, it should be the same across the globe, and it isn't. But what's the same is this false narrative about race and how useful it is to promote different political agendas.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm using my power, like my magical powers, like way too much today. But I know that Shelly has a question. So I was wondering if you wanted to unmute yourself. So I'm gonna ask you to unmute. But if you want, I can always like ask the question for you.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for your inspiring and amazing work in advocacy. I wanted to ask you, because we hear about the disparate maternal outcomes in the US versus specifically just looking at other wealthy nations. Unfortunately, tragically, even poor countries like Cuba have a better maternal mortality rate than
Yeah,
the United States.
right.
So, yeah, so if we look at, let's just say, the countries we know that have socialized medicine, universal health care, Canada, pretty much all of Europe. Do you have knowledge as to the maternal outcomes of Black women and women of color in those countries as compared to the United States?
Yeah, I haven't studied it, as I mentioned, and I know Jenny Douglas is on here. I see her lovely face right now. And I know that Dr. Douglas has done research on this topic in the UK. My understanding, and I have seen studies of this as well, is that there are racial inequities in maternal mortality and morbidity in the UK as well as in the United States. I, I believe the maternal mortality rate is not, I know it isn't as high as in the United States. But one thing that this shows, and this is true in the family policing context as well, because I've also been in connection with a group of social workers in the UK who are examining the removals of Black children from their homes by child welfare agencies. In fact, I just a couple of weeks ago met at the United Nations with a working group that is looking at the welfare of children of African descent in Europe, and the removal of Black immigrant children from families. So my point in bringing this together is that on the one hand, stronger social welfare systems do reduce childhood poverty and do improve health of the nation in general. And I wholeheartedly support, I think the United States should have universal single payer healthcare. I absolutely believe that that would, and we know, would improve the health of the nation, including the most disadvantaged groups in the United States. It also would reduce the removal of Black children from their homes on for reasons of neglect, which are actually confused with poverty. But we also have to make sure that the systems or approaches to health and child welfare are anti-racist, because racism and white supremacist approaches, biases, prejudices, and structures, even in a nation with a strong social welfare system, will still target Black and brown people and Native people, Indigenous people, as we see in Canada. With, Canada has long had an issue of removing First Nations children from their homes. So we need both. We need strong welfare supports for families, but they also have to be anti-racist. We have to weed out the racism that exists in these systems. And it has to be simultaneous, because a big part of the reason we have such a punitive approach to child welfare in the United States is because of these narratives about Black mothers that I talked about today. It's because there's this idea that Black mothers aren't capable of caring for their children or don't care for their children. And that has to be addressed and ended. And this is part of why I think we need approaches that are community-based, so that Black communities have more control over their systems or resources for health and children's welfare. I see that, if I could take the prerogative, I see that Jenny Douglas has her hand up, and I'm sure she has something to add to the answer to that question. I see. Elsie Gale is here too. So she's also one of the researchers I was mentioning about that I'm connected with in terms of the family policing system. So I'm really happy that both of you are here on this session.
Dr. Douglas, I unmuted you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Roberts. I'm always inspired by your research. You've been inspiring me for decades, for more than 30 years. So thank you. I just wanted to say something, and perhaps Elsie would like to add something about Black women and maternal mortality and maternal morbidity here in the UK. Even though we supposedly have a universal healthcare system, we have a national health service, Black women are still 4 to 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childcare here in the UK, and at childbirth here in the UK. And, just 2 weeks ago, we had the launch of 2 reports, one by Birthrights, one by 5 Times More, that actually talked about the negative experiences of Black women in relation to maternal health here in the UK, and that reinforced everything that has been said about, health providers having myths and notions about, their ability to withstand pain, not being able to recognise when Black women's health is deteriorating within a maternal care setting. And, we have these 2 recent surveys, but we still do not know why it is that Black women here in the UK are more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth. And beneath that is a whole layer of morbidity, a whole raft of morbidity. And it is not just due to, layers of inequality and maternal and deprivation. So, we need to understand why Black women are having these experiences. And, I would argue that a lot of the underlying beliefs about race science underpin our health services, including our maternity care services. That's my view, but perhaps Elsie's got something to say?
I'm gonna ask Elsie to unmute. Yeah, there we go.
So thank you very much, Professor Roberts. It was great to hear you yet again. And I've been following you ever since Jenny Douglas introduced me to you. And it is really great to see all the participants from right across the globe who are taking part in this really important seminar today. I am not a researcher. I'm not even an academic. I am a practicing midwife, hands-on, frontline, and it is my considered opinion as an experienced midwife that we can do as much research as we like. If we don't actually have the action, we know what the action is.
Yeah.
We don't have the action to, well, some people are saying decolonize the care that women are given right across the sectors in health, then we will have no change. I'm not into research for research's sake. I'm into research for solutions to be enacted, not just talked about and filed away on the shelves. We have loads of that. The other thing I'd put in the chat is the fact that I think there is a difference in how women of African descent are described in the US, but also here. So if we look at the Embrace report, which is the triennial reporting for maternal health in this country, in the UK, but it is reported every year. What we see is that Black women are divided up into various different categories. So for myself, even though I am of mixed heritage, I identify as a Black woman, a woman of African descent. But in terms of the Embrace report, I would be a mixed race woman. So if you combine all of those women of African descent, what we will see is that the statistics, as far as I'm concerned, are a heck of a lot bigger than what is described. But yeah, I thank you very, very much for the opportunity to just speak to that. And I look forward to listening again when it comes on the website.
And if I could just say, I'm sorry I misidentified you as a researcher. And as you saw in my talk, and you know from my work, I'm so grateful to midwives. As I said, I think that midwives are part of the people who put the research and what we know we have to do into action. So I'm really grateful for your work and for my connection with you.
So thank you very much for being with us today, Professor Roberts. Like, this was really fantastic, super, super timely. And thank you to the audience for being so kind and nice with your questions and comments and all of that. And hopefully see you next year for another series of events. Thank you very much, all.
Thanks, everybody.